This is the Writers Podcast, a Writers After Dark radio production, bringing you the best in writing advice, news, trends, and interviews. Hosted by award-winning authors S.K. Anthony and Raymond Esposito.
Hello, and thanks for joining us for the Writers Podcast. I'm Raymond Esposito, and I'm here with my co-host, that siren of South America, and the primary driver behind increasing wine sales in the United States, S. Catherine Anthony.
Cheers, everyone. This wine is great.
This wine is my wine. This wine is... Oh, that's kind of combining the wine in America thing. Anyways, speaking of publishing...
Yes, now actually I was going to say, speaking of my wine, you increased sales of vodka. He's a vodka guy through and through.
I am.
Which he needs to write his books. Mm-hmm. And speaking of...
And doing podcasts.
Did you know that deciding to publish your written work is just one part of the book equation?
It is. Today's writers have publishing options. They can use traditional publishing methods, court a small press company, or self-publish using platforms like Amazon, Lightning Press, or several of the other smaller outlets.
And while it's a very personal decision to choose which option is best for you, making that decision is easier when you've had a chance to consider the pros and cons of each.
Yes, and in this episode, we're going to focus on traditional versus self-publishing and leave the small press considerations for another episode.
We're going to lay out the benefits and drawbacks of each so you can compare and decide which features are most important to you. We have to consider that written communication as a form of storytelling is an intricate part of both the human experience and history.
I find the history of publishing to be a fascinating study in how circular this process really has been. Even before there was modern words, early men drew images into stories on cave walls. Egyptians placed their hieroglyphics in public places. There's always been this self-publishing.
Yeah, when you mention them and the hieroglyphics, I keep wondering what they'll think if they ever see our emojis.
It's the new hieroglyphics.
Yes. Would they think that we advanced or that we went backwards? Anyway.
I don't know. I don't think they're coming back, Catherine. I don't think they were aliens, but okay.
Oh, well, either way. As writers, we have this need to not only tell stories, but to share them with as many others as possible. That sharing is what we call publishing.
And today, any writer would be thrilled to sell their novel to a prestigious publisher.
But as we mentioned, thanks to the ever-changing book industry, today there are more opportunities to make it big than ever before. Enough options, in fact, that even you could turn down an offer from any of the big 5 book publishers in favor of self-publishing.
Yeah, it's so interesting that modern technology has allowed for a resurrection of self-publishing. I call it a resurrection because history shows that what we refer to as traditional publishing methods is a far newer system than the self-publishing method.
The first real ability to publish in mass began in the 1500s in Germany, but it would be another 300 years before book publishing would begin to look like its modern version.
If I can believe what they told me in that movie The Day After Tomorrow, the first published book was the Gutenberg Bible, but I don't know if I can trust that. But additionally, book agents are also relatively a new convention. They've only been on the scene since around the year 1900.
No kidding.
Yeah.
We often look at the madness, debate, and arguments over traditional and self-publishing as if these are something new.
Yeah, but the history books show that publishers were in a constant battle with one another since the 1500s. They've been competing for authors' ownership and trying to control pricing for over 500 years. It was these types of battles and many of the underhanded tactics that they used, especially in dealing with authors, that led Britain to pen the first Copyright Act in 1709.
That's pretty cool to know. I didn't know that. But also, we've grown accustomed to the idea that traditional publishing is the brass ring for an author. But in the chicken or egg debate in publishing, it's important to remember that the traditional model is only around 100 years old, and it is self-publishing and small press publishing that has the longest and richest history.
And you just can't discuss publishing without entering into a debate, often a public one, over the disruption that the latest iteration of self-publishing has caused. It's an argument over authenticity that emerged around 2005 when Amazon changed the industry by offering a professional platform that allowed any author to produce and distribute their books.
That change wasn't just driven by the platform. vanity presses had existed for a long time. What made Amazon different was that writers had both a means to publish and access to Amazon's worldwide audience of book buyers. And as we've seen over time, the popularity of ebooks and self-published books caught into the traditional publishers already struggling for profits.
Yeah, it's always about money, and ultimately that competition also affected traditional published authors. And some have not been shy in making full-out generalized attacks against self-published authors. I think one of the most offensive and disingenuous comments came from best-selling author Sue Grafton, who said in an interview, "To me, it seems disrespectful that a wannabe assumes it's all so easy she or he can put out a published novel without bothering to read, study, or do the research. Self-publishing," she continues, "is a shortcut, and I don't believe in shortcuts when it comes to the arts. I compare self-publishing to a student managing to conquer 5 easy pieces on the piano and then wondering if he's ready to be booked into Carnegie Hall. Personally, I'd like to remind Ms. Grafton that G is for generalizations, F is for fallacy of argument, and if I were being completely honest, S is for shut your mouth with your one never-ending character line. See? Everyone, Sue, has an opinion."
Oh goodness, don't they? But I think best-selling indie author Hugh Howey said it best in response to Grafton. He said, and I quote, "Why is self-publishing antithetical to honing one's craft? Whoever received writing advice in a rejection letter as sound as the worst 1-star review out there."
Yeah, he is absolutely correct. There is no rejection letter in the world that is critical or cutting as a 1-star review.
There are merits to the arguments on the quality of some self-published authors.
Yes, there are.
Yeah, but there are also traditionally published authors whose work is trashed by readers and critics alike.
That is also true. I think it's fine to have a quality discussion about the work, but generalizing the talents of self-published authors, saying they aren't as good just doesn't stand against all the examples of excellence we've seen from the indie author community.
Yeah.
It's my opinion that the platform and the contract is not the measure of authenticity. If that was true, then works like Beowulf would be considered unauthentic because of the lack of a publisher. And the same would be true of everything Ben Franklin published on his own printing press.
And the bigger truth is, readers don't really care how your book is published. They only care if your book is good. When you think about it, most people will have a favorite book and they'll know the name of the author, but they're going to have absolutely no clue who the publisher is.
Yeah, and if you look at traditionally published authors, they switch teams as much as any athlete does, right? They go to the next publisher for the next big deal. So, but I think alongside the authenticity argument, deciding which is the best route to publication is also a question of one's need for affirmation.
We all know traditional publishing can feel more prestigious. Getting published by a traditional publishing house has a fantastic ring to it, doesn't it?
Ding dong, ding dong.
Especially though, if it's one of the big
Who's
5.
down in Whoville.
If it's one of the big 5, like Hachette, HarperCollins, Macmillan, Penguin Random House, and Simon & Schuster, anybody would feel amazing with that.
Sure, for some authors, it's the perfect validation. And since most authors are best at self-doubting their abilities, getting that green light from the gatekeepers is the ultimate proof or endorsement of one's writing ability. But there are, of course, ways for self-published authors to get affirmations. I don't think there's any better affirmation than positive reviews of your book.
And you can also enter contests and vie for book awards.
And of course, their sales. Consider some of the indie books that have gone on to become bestsellers and make a ton of money.
And some authors can even land a publishing deal after reaching success with their self-published book. For example, Still Alice by Lisa Genova, The Martian by Andy Weir. Both of those, they became award-winning movies while they were still self-pubbed. And probably the most well-known self-published success in these recent years is E.L. James.
Oh.
Yes, E.L. James for 50 Shades of Grey.
Oh, Vampire Diaries with sex.
Actually, it's Twilight, but okay.
Oh, I guess I don't even know the difference. The aforementioned indie author Hugh Howey, and he's a huge advocate of self-publishing, but he went to pick up a lucrative contract afterwards from one of the big 5 publishing houses.
Still though, if you're starting out and you really want that external affirmation, traditional publishing can offer that, and in an immediate way that self-publishing cannot.
True. I have one reason for not wanting to pursue a traditional contract, and it's the gatekeeping aspects of the industry. In traditional publishing, one of the drawbacks is you need an agent. So there's this need to sell an agent on your story before they'll bring it to the actual people who publish the story.
Yes, you can go straight to the publisher like Nicholas Spark did, but then you risk your work sitting. Yeah, he's a Notebook guy. The one movie you haven't watched and I keep telling you have to watch, and I dare you not to cry. Well, I mean, like I said, you could go to the publisher like he did, but then you risk your work sitting unread in a slush pile.
Yeah, I know you love that movie and that book and everything, but just consider that his career began by luck. An editor just happened to pull his manuscript out of that slush pile, and the same is true for J.K. Rowling. So circumventing the agent certainly puts your success in the hands of Lady Luck. I think you still need the agent.
Yeah, you need both. That agent itself requires a dreaded query letter. I'm a writer, but I don't have a lot of interest in writing a one-page sales pitch to dozens of agents.
Or a book blurb. And the agents themselves are not without their own subjectivity. A few years ago, I conducted my own ad hoc non-scientific study of agents, and I randomly selected 100 agents, 25 of which were professed to be new to the business.
That's great. What did you find?
Well, what I discovered was that although they all claimed to have an interest in new, fresh voices, that didn't extend to new, fresh categories. In fact, 98% of the agents listed young adult and contemporary women's fiction as the stuff that really excites them.
Yeah, I guess you can't get away from subjectivity even as an agent.
No, but think about it. There are about 100 genres and readers for all of them. But if 98% of the gatekeepers are looking for work in just two categories, then how is traditional publishing possibly serving the readers? I mean, gatekeepers are problematic if you write in a niche or niche, and especially if it's a small one that doesn't have a, million-person readership.
But I feel like this is an advantage for self-published authors. You can bypass the gatekeepers with your niche book and publish for your target audience.
That's true.
Publishing houses have an expectation, and many markets are too small for them. But for you, it might be perfect. Really, though, why should your readers miss out on your stories just because traditional publishers can't make, a lot of money off it?
No, that's a valid point. And again, it's not to trash the traditionally published route. It's just, hey, these are the things that you're up against. And the other issue, though, with the gatekeeping for me and for many authors is just the time.
Oh, goodness, yes. From the query experience to submissions, changes, approvals, contract negotiations, to actually seeing your book published. Well, I think it could take as long as 3 years. I think the average is about 2 years.
Yeah. And as my own research points out, and every modern writer knows that publishing selections, what they want to print, isn't just based on the quality of the work or even how great a story you've written. Today, publishers and agents choose books based on what they believe will sell. And if the book sale numbers are any example of how well they pick winners and losers, well, it seems like they pick an awful lot of losers.
That's not true, but they could get a lot more winners the other way. But, if you have a new or a unique idea, it could be ignored simply because it's so different from what is currently selling.
Yeah, it's a preference for something called familiar but different. And an example would be, an agent telling you that they're looking for a book that is like a female version of Harry Potter. And in the traditional publishing world, there's a lot of competition. You really need to be competitive if you want a traditional publisher, and you've got to be willing to suffer all the gates that you need to pass through.
Of course, the lack of gatekeeping in self-publishing also has its drawbacks. The biggest being, you can hurt your career and your name by publishing something that isn't quite ready.
It's a nice way of saying junk.
Yeah.
But it's true, the onus of quality is really on the self-published author. So, they have a lot of homework to do, and in general, a lot of work to do to be ready for prime time.
Yeah.
But you brought up a really good point on the delays. Not only getting through the gatekeepers, but typically the publisher themselves could take 12 to 24 months to publish a book. And I can't imagine waiting that long.
Well, for famous bestsellers, they don't mind because they receive huge advances. So, they've been paid for most of the work already.
Yes, and if you're a new author, you might be both surprised and disappointed by what traditional publishers are currently offering as an advance. Today, it runs around $5,000. So first, you won't be quitting your day job on that kind of money. And second, it's going to be a long time before you see any royalties.
Which reminds me, for self-publishing, pricing and royalty, I feel like it works in your favor. Not only do you have control over the price of your book, but you can earn higher royalties and enjoy immediate sales. Although with today's numbers, it could take you years or even never to reach that $5,000 advance.
I'm going to have a party. Your royalties are also much smaller with traditional publishers. It's around 10% for hardcover, 8% for trade paperbacks, whereas as a self-published author, typically you're going to keep 60 to 80% of your sales. And then there's the contract. Publishing contracts are mostly one-sided. You either sign it or you don't. And for that small advance, you'll be giving up most of your rights to your work.
And publishers don't typically buy the rights to distribute your work. They buy the rights to your work. They own it. Once they do, and depending on the agreement, you can have very little say on when that book hits the shelf.
Yeah, it could be a year, it could be 2 years, and it can be never. Like the music industry, you can have a bestseller. Your book could make millions worldwide and even be turned into a movie. But as the author, you might make very little of that depending on what rights you've turned over in that contract.
And any sales you do have, getting those royalties can be even a longer process. Amazon, for example, usually pays within 30 to 60 days. A traditional contract, though, will probably lay out a schedule, but in a larger publisher, you might wait as long as 6 months.
And what you earn is going to first be paid towards any advance, publisher fees, and whatever percentage your agent takes out. And that contract is just one form of control. In the bigger picture, there's also the question of editorial control.
It's true that traditional publishers have the means to produce your book from start to finish. But all you have to do is, surrender control of business decision for your book. I don't think that I'm okay with that.
Surrender, Dorothy. Wizard of Oz reference. Yeah. With a publisher, you're signing over the editorial rights to your book. They could potentially ask you for so many changes that, these changes might not be changes that you want.
Yeah, for example, they could ask you to delete entire sections.
They can, and my favorite example of that is Stephen King's bestseller, The Stand. In his original version, it was around 1,200 pages, and his publisher absolutely refused the idea of publishing such a long story. So King had to delete over 400 pages from the work. Now, years later, when his popularity and sales afforded him the clout to maintain complete creative control, he republished The Stand with all of its 1,200 pages.
Wow. And did you read that version too?
I did, and it's an interesting side note. Although as a fan, I enjoyed the additional material, as a writer, it was clear that the 800-page version was every bit as good and probably better paced. In fact, since gaining editorial control, one of the biggest criticisms he receives is his books do tend to ramble.
Okay, I don't know about rambling, but as far as wanting to have control, Stephen King isn't the only SK that likes that, because personally, I like being able to tell my story my way too. And I really like choosing my own cover and my own title. Those things are important to me, and I know that in a traditional contract, they can override your opinion. I'm not okay with that.
Yes, but on the other hand, with a traditional publisher, you do get the expert guidance. People who will help you to ensure the editing is great, the cover is professional, and all the tech stuff is done. You may not like all the results, but they'll ensure it's professional.
Yes. I do wish I had that professional team. But, as a self-published author, you do have the full creative license and control. But you have to invest both time and money to ensure a professional quality book. And on average, a well-produced self-published book costs around $1,500. So if you don't have the money, it may not be a good option for you.
In fact, one of the biggest arguments against self-publishing is that often authors don't invest in these aspects. We've all run into the indie author who professes to be a one-of-a-kind self-editor.
Or the person using clip art on their ebook because they don't think that stuff matters.
Is there still such a thing as clip art? Yeah, there might be. Another plus to having a publisher is in terms of hitting deadlines. The contract is a good motivation not to procrastinate.
Sorry. You tell me if there's such a thing as clip art. You're the one who wrote that part.
I know. It's just funny.
Yeah, I always say as a pro for self-published authors, the only person who stops you from getting published is you. The other side of the coin, it's the con, which is, well, the only person who stops you from getting published is you. While you may need to learn how to prepare your book for publishing, you can do it at your own pace, but procrastination and putting others' needs in front of yours are your enemies.
As a self-published author, we have that awful luxury of not writing when we don't feel like it. When comparing the marketing for traditional versus self-publishing, for me, it's really an even spread of pros and cons.
A publisher will certainly provide greater support, and they'll ensure it gets into the right catalogs, that the pricing is correct, and they'll possibly get your book reviews. Most important, your book stands a much better chance of being in a bookstore than if you self-publish.
On the other hand, you can do all of those things if you make the effort. But, on the bookstores, in today's market, I just think it's questionable if there's any selling advantage to bookstores.
I don't know about advantage like that, but my pride would love it. Considering the majority of bookstores sold online, that's true. And you don't need a publisher to be on the biggest selling site, which is, Amazon.
Yeah. Again, the bookstore thing is more about affirmation than it is sales. Of course, I got my books into Barnes & Noble, and both of them sold. I did a little reverse shoplifting at my local store. I just went in and put them on the shelf myself. Voila.
That reminds me, last Thanksgiving week, we went on a cruise, and we actually tried to put our books in their library, but those untrusting boat people kept the books locked up. Like, there was literally a lock on a gate where the books were. You couldn't even read what the titles were.
I would have jimmied the lock for us, but there was far too many spectators, and I didn't want to get thrown off the boat.
Yeah.
But, the point is that as a self-published author, 100% of the marketing efforts, they're yours. You need to do all the things required, like platform building and ads and, all the things that need to be done to reach customers.
And if we bring in web presence, which is a huge part of being an author these days, the good news is, as far as social media goes, whether you're a traditional or a self-published author, the work and time you put in is still the same.
But in traditional publishing today, most require that you make at least 50% of the efforts. They expect you to be out there pushing your own work.
True. And even things like book tours and signings, you may be on your own with both in booking and in funding.
Yeah. And if you ever want a second contract with these guys, you'll have to work hard to get sales, because if you don't, chances are they're not going to re-sign you for the next book.
That's right.
I believe that in terms of authenticity, discussions on who published it are pretty much over. It just doesn't matter.
Yeah, we've just seen too many best-selling success from indie authors.
Yeah, in fact, the big publishers, they're trolling the ranks of self-published sales, and they're offering contracts to writers with strong brands and loyal reader base. The days of self-publishing being the kiss of death for a future traditional contract, those things are behind us.
And just based on what types of genres get published, it's clear that if you're a niche writer, the best way to reach your fan base is self-publishing. So the defining factors are these.
Do you need the affirmation that comes with a traditional deal?
2, are you willing to wait and willing to learn how to perfect the traditional gatekeeping process?
Do you have the time and the financial resources to produce a professional novel?
And how much creative control are you willing to give up in the publication of your book?
Hey, but the good news is that it's no longer an either-or decision.
Yeah, you can attempt both simultaneously, or as we discussed in another episode, you can take the middle ground and look for a small press publisher.
So while you think that all over, we're going to give you one more thing to consider. This quote from William Donahue, who said,
"Be firm about your goals, but flexible about your methods."
Thank you for listening to the Writers Podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. For more articles, news, and advice, visit our website, writersafterdark.net, or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. The Writers Podcast is a Writers After Dark radio production. Executive producers SK Anthony and Raymond Esposito. Copyright 2017.